The 49 processes and 5 process groups. A process is a series of activities directed towards causing an end result. One or more inputs create one or more outputs. I like to use the example here of baking a cake. With the inputs, what goes into baking a cake? What items do we require before the process can start? Well, we know that we need cake mix. We know we need an egg, vegetable oil, and then we're going to also need possibly some vanilla extract, icing, sprinkles, whatever else that we're going to need in order to go ahead and do this. With tools and techniques, a tool is often something tangible. This is something that we use to manipulate those inputs to create the output. A technique is the defined systematic procedure to perform an activity. It basically tells us how are we using these tools. So in the case of baking a cake, the tools could be the mixing bowl, the whisk, the oven, the baking pan, and maybe a spatula to apply the icing. The technique could include how long do we have to stir the ingredients together for? In what order or sequence do we add ingredients? What do we preheat the oven to? So 350 degrees. How long do we bake the cake for? About 22 to 25 minutes. And then how do we check for doneness? Place a toothpick in the center, pull it out, see if it's clean. And then how long do we allow it to cool before we apply icing? The output is a product, service, or result generated by a process. The output may be an input to subsequent processes. Inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs. Obviously, using an example of a cake is pretty easy. We can just kind of deduce exactly what would go into it. Route memorization is not what we recommend when it comes to the EDOs. There are over 650 of them, with over 1,200 if we include sub-bullets. The important thing to memorize is the outputs of each process. If I told you that the output of a process is a cake, you can kind of logically deduce exactly what goes into it and what types of tools and techniques you would need for it. The same type of thing should happen as we proceed through this course. If you start thinking about the outputs of a process, you can start thinking about what do you need in order to generate that output and how would you generate that output. You don't want to ignore these EDOs. When you're reading the PMBOK guide, ensure that you're reading the EDOs as well. Make sure to note the flow of the EDOs between processes. One aspect of the PMBOK that is worth special attention is the data flow diagram for the various processes, which show where the inputs come from and where the outputs will go. Make sure to check out our PMP strategy guide for more guidance on the EDOs. So, an introduction to the 5 process groups. We see that monitoring and controlling processes are the backdrop of the other process groups. We will be monitoring and controlling the project throughout its entire life cycle. The initiating processes will basically start the project or phase. From here, we will conduct our planning processes. Once planning has been completed, we will begin executing. Now, we do see that executing and planning feed into each other. This is because planning is iterative. While the work is going on, we may identify areas of the plan that need to be modified in some type of a way, and we will go ahead and modify that plan through integrated change control. This can drive the executing in a new direction. Eventually, once we have an accepted deliverable, we will move into closing. It is very important to remind you, process groups are necessary in every project. We will always have all 5 process groups invoked. Phases are optional. If we decide to subdivide the project in some type of a way, that would be a phase. Every phase would also use all 5 process groups. So a process group is a logically grouped subset of project management processes. They do not always occur sequentially. Some processes are done just once at a predefined moment. Other processes are performed throughout the project, and some are performed as needed. One of the biggest problems that people have is trying to look at this as if they will happen perfectly sequentially, as if we finish initiating, then start planning, then start executing, and then start monitoring and controlling. Already we can see the issue here because monitoring and controlling will happen throughout the entire life cycle. So the way that we're logically grouping these processes, when we talk about initiating, defining the new project or phase, obtaining authorization to start that project or phase. With planning, is how do we establish a complete scope of the project? How do we define those objectives and courses of action? Executing is where we actually perform the work that we defined in the plan. With monitoring and controlling, we're evaluating and reacting to the performance of the project. By comparing performance against plan, we can make a determination as to whether or not variance thresholds have been reached or exceeded, and we can submit some type of corrective or possibly preventive change to make sure that we stay on track. And finally, we have the closing process group. It's important to note that while the closing process group within the PMBOK framework only has one process, an organization may have other processes that would be included as well.